we need to talk about D&D. There was definitely a time where the very notion of trying to convince your friends to play something that wasn't Dungeons and Dragons was almost laughable. The dominance that the Dragon game had over its competition was, for those who were less than enamored with its limited scope and systems, pretty overwhelming and demotivating. It wasn't that long before then that even the very notion of getting your friends to play any role-playing game was a Herculean task. And after years of role-playing games eking themselves into the public consciousness through pop culture and changing trends in the perception of the kinds of people who play these games, it's now pretty safe to claim that tabletop role-playing has decidedly become mainstream. Every comedy show on Earth, it seems, has at the very least mentioned RPGs in some capacity through gags, characters, and sometimes even whole episodes based around or set inside of imagined worlds through the lens of their ensemble casts. YouTubers, streamers, and social media influencers, from tiny niche channels to those with massive platforms, are playing, talking about, and editorializing RPGs, regardless of how far removed their channel's focuses may be from the tabletop gaming. Some of the biggest shows on video game dominated platforms like Twitch are explicitly casts of professional TTRPG players whacking goblins and rolling dice without a controller or RGB keyboard in sight. Not to mention that at the time of writing this, there is a literal animated series freshly released on Amazon Prime that's a straight retelling of Critical Role's first D&D campaign. But one inescapable similarity that all of these mainstream showings of the role-playing space had in common, up until quite recently, was the absolutely dogged loyalty they had to Wizard of the Coast's flagship fantasy offering. We'd gone from TTRPGs basically not existing to a slow and eventual dominant position in mainstream audiences that D&D was the only TTRPG that existed. To this day, most of those with a casual perception of the TTRPG space will not actually understand what you're talking about when you say the word TTRPG or role-playing games, unless they're framed from their similarity or peership to Dungeons and Dragons, then you may as well be speaking another language. Thankfully, the winds are changing, and with larger actual play series and publications exploring the wide range of games that exist outside of the Forgotten Realms, we will likely see a surge of hungry new roleplayers wondering what waits for them outside of the D&D cave of shadows that they've been unknowingly trapped inside. Even shows that have made their fortune off of the back of D&D are stepping into uncharted territory and showing off much smaller titles like Monster Hearts, Kids on Brooms, and the ever-present Honey Heist. Meanwhile, as other options present themselves and as the general TTRPG audience starts to mature, D&D has become the subject of more and more valid criticism, from its outdated views on race and gender and the shaky foundations that both are built upon, to the clunky rule set and backwards design. It's not uncommon for any mention of the RPG behemoth to be met with groans and rolling eyes from those that are, frankly, sick at the sight of it. But as public perceptions change, and the maybe slightly smug RPG players that have been evangelizing indie RPG offerings that D&D players are starting to discover, myself included, are getting their way, there's a worrying trend that I've observed from those really tuned into the hobby. With oversaturation comes boredom and frustration, and the very same is true for D&D. Articles, videos, news stories, or what have you that even mention those two letters and an ampersand will face two distinct types of vitriol on social media. The first is more a general problem. Publish any kind of a criticism of a popular IP, no matter how mild, and there's always the inevitable backlash from mega fans who, in this hellish future we find ourselves in, seemingly stake their entire identities on corporate brands. Side note, please don't be this person. Just let people enjoy things is a perfectly good mantra, but it does need to be paired with people are allowed to not enjoy things publicly, and criticism is good. The second type of backlash that you face, I personally find more worrying, and it's the anger that comes from those who are tired of D&D's dominance themselves. For those readers, it almost seems the content of these articles and videos pertaining to the dungeon crawler monolith is irrelevant. To talk about D&D in general is almost a personal slight, even if you're raising fair and valid criticism. Heck, even an article that ends with the resolution, "you should play something else," can be lambasted with comments on social media of, "just don't play D&D then," from those that respond to the article's headline rather than content. And that's a problem that is also very widespread and a habit that I can find myself slipping into as well. For those of us that don't want to play Dungeons & Dragons, that are desperate for mainstream attention to be shifted towards other, more deserving games, there's a tendency to just ignore the elephant in the room, to demand that we simply stop talking about it. But I'm not sure that helps. The TTRPG market may well have made strides towards a post-D&D monolith culture, and I'm ecstatic that it has, but we're very much not out of the woods yet. Vast swathes of people still see D&D as the only valid option, still only consume D&D content, and still refuse to try anything new. I just hope that I'm not alone in thinking that those people are still worth reaching out to. For every 10 role players out there that have only ever heard or known Dungeons & Dragons, sure, you'll get the one mega fan that's dragon till they die, toxic obsession levels have invested, and probably aren't going to be trying out a one-page indie journaling game anytime soon, but there's also the other 9 players who just aren't aware of the other options. And just like with any introduction to a new hobby, probably similar to the ways in which they were introduced to D&D as a hobby in the first place, you do have to meet these people halfway. You do have to frame things in a way they understand from their limited experience. You do have to help them navigate the flaws of the game they're playing and understand the choices that they have outside of it. And a lot of the time, that means you do have to talk about D&D. There is a level of snobbery that I'm sure we've all partaken in when you're in the know about something that a lot of people aren't. I mean, I shudder to think of all the people that I've turned away from the incredible games that exist out there because instead of taking my time to explain to them why D&D doesn't do it for me, I just sort of dismissively scoffed at the very mention of it. This isn't exclusive to RPGs either. I mean, look at the way that a lot of people sneer at those enjoying a game of Monopoly, or the frothing rage that capital G gamers have towards those innocently playing Candy Crush. Sometimes our passionate drive to get more exposure to amazing, smaller games just dilutes into angry comments and even straight up gatekeeping. I'm all for valid criticism and calling out large companies that make bad decisions. I would hope that there's enough examples on the Dicebreaker website and YouTube channel that show that. But whilst I'm desperate for more people out there to play literally anything that isn't D&D, I personally think it's going to take a lot more patience than we're sometimes willing to give. So you may see us here on the Dicebreaker YouTube channel or on Dicebreaker.com talking about things through the lens of D&D. Heck, the biggest video that we have on the channel is just us recommending RPGs we like, but to reach more people, we framed it as 10 RPGs that aren't D&D. Now, part of that is obviously the YouTube game. If we put Dungeons & Dragons in the title, we get more views, and views keep the lights on. Sorry, that is unfortunately just how it is. But that's not the only reason. That video is our most watched on the channel for a reason, because when people are looking to take their first steps away from D&D, when they're bored of the same old, or are just looking for games to play on top of their weekly session, they're going to be looking for games like D&D. So if you're a fan of RPGs, or maybe even if you designed them, and someone asks you, hey, is this game like D&D, or why should I play this instead of D&D? At the very least, try not to be a dick about it. At best though, if they're not just being facetious themselves, maybe answer those questions. Because I reckon there's a lot of people out there who genuinely want to know. If you're a fan or reader of Dicebreaker and you roll your eyes every time we put D&D in the title, first of all, I'm sorry. I wish we didn't have to, but also hear us out. We might have something more interesting to say than you'd expect. Lastly, if you're a D&D fan who's not really stepped out of the Forgotten Realms before and you've made it to the end of this video, then here's a little message that's just for you specifically. If you want to just play D&D forever, that's absolutely fine. I don't think you're hurting anyone. But if you've been questioning if it's the game for you, or maybe if you're unhappy with how Wizards of the Coast have been acting, and maybe you want to give them a little less money and attention, then there's a wonderful world of amazing games out there just waiting for you to discover them. And there's likely one that is the literal perfect fit for the kind of role-playing that you enjoy. Have a look around, get recommendations from people like us, or your friends, or RPG players that you know and trust and care about. But just do whatever makes you happy. Well, that's my 2 cents anyway. Please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. Whilst you're at it, I'd love for you to hit the subscribe button and ring the bell icon so that you can see more of us here on Dicebreaker. You can also head on over to dicebreaker.com for more fantastic tabletop content of all sorts, from news to reviews and previews. Hey, why not give us a like as well? That would be nice. So thanks so much for watching me ramble on, and I'll see you on the next video we put out. But until then, stay safe, have a good time, and have a lovely day.